Okay. Hey, everybody. So my name is Jeff Harrell. I work with PayPal. About last year, we announced that we were going Node for most of our production stack. And since we've had a lot of companies reach out to us and want to know how we did it, how we adopted it, how we convinced sort of the overlords of the company to make it work. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about sort of some of the issues we've run into and the anti-patterns in this case that we actually experienced along the way, and hopefully encourage people to not do the same thing. So a little bit of context. We first went live with Node in 2013, right? But it's been a year. It's been, I think, I'm not even going to try to do the math right now. It's been a year. When we went live, we had one app that was live. It was our consumer-facing portal. We now have 35 apps that are live. And these are major things. There are home pages, our external pages, our payment pages, onboarding pages, sign-up pages, et cetera. Pretty much at some point, all major parts of the site are actually running live on Node. And so we've had a large portion of our engineering developer teams go through the Node process. That said, most of them came from a Java or C++ background. And so we've also had to train 400 new JavaScript engineers. And it's worked out mostly well, actually. I would say most of them are pretty pleased with the move so far, which is great. However, they've all made awesome mistakes along the way. And when you have a large portion of people going through and doing Node at the same time, you can't keep tabs on everyone. Other little fun fact, just from a build standpoint, per day we have about 500,000 NPM installs coming through our internal servers. So that's just the quantity that we have being developed right now. So anyways, that said, that's context. So jumping into the anti-patterns themselves. And the first one, actually people have discussed a little bit today. It's don't bringing baggage from your previous stack with you. It seems to be a common thing, be it from Rails or Java or ASP.NET, whatever stack you have. In our case, it was Java. And when you drag a lot of people from one technology platform to another, it's inevitable that they effectively want to port and rebuild everything they have and the way they did it on the new technology stack. So in this case, actually, I just have a couple of quotes that I had to deal with over the last year that I swear came up like a dozen times each. The first one I have a little bit generic. It's Node doesn't support X. It won't work for me. In our case, this was actually probably the funniest one because it had various flavors, and my favorite was does Node support Spring Webflow? No, it doesn't. No. Well, if it doesn't support Webflow, we can't build our apps in that. This won't work. We have to use Java. And we had a couple teams that were adamant around that at first. And so various different approaches were used with that. A lot of it was actually just sort of educating teams like, hey, look, don't I know you built with Webflow originally, but like break that mindset. Don't port. Actually learn JavaScript. Understand how to deal with it in JavaScript. Maybe use some of the proper patterns. Like maybe you used it as a crutch. Maybe you didn't. Today we have, I think, out of all the teams that wanted to specifically use Webflow, only one is using any sort of like Flow task manager-based module that we created. The other ones have all actually just walked away from that holistically. Also, coming from a Java background, we had the greatest one where it was every single team that we picked up and started adopting Node. And for the most part, they were, in the beginning at least, serialized. So like one by one, we would adopt new teams. Every team would get up there and would be like stressing, like, how do I deal with Node module version conflicts? Like, what's the way to do this in Node? Like, I don't understand. And it was like, what do you mean? I don't understand what you're talking about. And they'd explain it, and you're like, oh, you're talking about Maven dependency. Yeah, we don't have Maven. Like, that's not an issue here. Like, you don't have to worry about what this, what version this is using and what version you're using, and if they conflict. Like, doesn't usually happen. But it was interesting that every team got up there and really stressed that in the beginning. Interesting from that perspective. And then the other one was covered earlier too, which was a lot of teams that were stressing over, I can't let the app restart. Like I have to do whatever it takes to capture all errors, like prevent anything from the app ever crashing because it'll take too long to come back up. And then it was like, have you restarted your app in development? Yes, it takes a second. Okay, like what's the concern? Well, I don't know, good point. So these are a couple of our examples, at least. The underlying theme is ultimately, like, leave your baggage behind. I have my little side quote, except if you're flying, like, don't do that. But leave your baggage behind. Actually, like, learn the new stack. This was our biggest issue with getting traction up front. And especially from a company, when you're adopting it, you don't necessarily have a lot of great patterns with your existing apps for people to learn from. And so everyone goes and starts trying things out how they knew how to do it with their previous stack. So leave your baggage behind. Anti-pattern number 2 is monolithic applications, which always seems to come up. And in our case, PayPal's history was effectively, if you've ever looked at our URLs, some of them are so old at this point, but we had like a massive C++ binary that we deployed that was like the world of PayPal. That was a decade ago, and then we moved over to Java, and we fragmented our apps, but they were effectively, as I like to refer to them, as mini monolithic apps. So we would deploy an application, but it was like holistically its own application. They wrote all the code. 99% of that code may have been duplicated over in this application. Doesn't matter. They're various different teams. And so actually leveraging Node and NPM properly helps avoid this. And so one of the things we did early on was stand up our own NPM instance internally. And that helped out. We were able to deploy our infrastructure code, but actually encouraging teams then to use it was also a harder thing. Teams would go down and they would effectively embed most of their functionality in their app. And if I jump ahead a little bit, there's, if you think of like any typical PayPal app, there's things like onboarding a user or adding a credit card or adding a bank, et cetera. Teams would effectively go build their application and build all of this in their application. And we saw this early on with a bunch of our apps as they ported to Node, was they were, again, using the porting word, porting. And so they were taking their Java app and effectively redoing it over in Node, which made them not think about things like that. And so we really started encouraging teams to publish things as modules rather than actually embedding the functionality in their app. And this is just food for thought when building your apps. And actually, as you adopt Node or as you move forward with Node, is make sure you actually are leveraging NPM modules and following that philosophy of just having small modules that do one thing and making it easy. Key part on that last one is to also not overloading modules. As soon as we got teams to start making modules and building modularized apps, they then started making module and being like, I'm modularized, because their app would effectively depend on a single module that then had like everything in it. And so it was progress. We got them to modularize, and then we now needed to push it a little bit more and get them to modularize the modules. Yeah, I like that. So anyways, sort of the key part with that anti-pattern is build with many blocks, not with one. Playing with one block is never fun. So 3, this was also sort of the fun one. Like, has anyone Googled anything about JavaScript and then not put like Node in front of it? I remember actually there's I'm pointing back at Eric because I'm thinking of a conversation with him a long time ago where I was complaining about this facet of it, and I was like, dude, just Google like searching an array or something, crap. And I was like pulled it up on Google and like, look, the first result's jQuery. And so this was really early on when we started it, but it was sort of funny, like, jQuery results dominate search engines. And so if you have a lot of team members that don't know much about JavaScript or are learning it firsthand, there was a Node app or two that had jQuery in them, and they were using it to do iterations and things. And it was just like, what's going on? Why are you doing that? And then you ask them, they're like, oh, that makes sense. Well, I Googled it, and then, yeah, don't do that. So, a little bit is understanding actually, like, I think everyone in this room understands this for the larger point, but just let's understand JavaScript and actually how it works. Let's understand that when we search for JavaScript, that results are for obviously the server and the client. This is the one con, effectively, of having JavaScript span the server and client, is that, if you have JavaScript on Node, that's one thing. If you have JavaScript in the browser, you pretty much play by IE's rules, in which case you maybe don't have the best JavaScript. But also, in the sense of understanding JavaScript, like understand the latest JavaScript, understand where JavaScript is going, and maybe you leverage the modern things, maybe you don't, but at least understand them so that you know how to tap into them. So yeah, learn JavaScript before diving in. And just calling that out specifically, I think we had a fairly sane training course that we were sending engineers through, but they would get really excited by this training course, and then they would immediately jump out of the training course and start knocking out their Node apps. And it was like, no, take a little bit of time, like play with it, like write an app, throw it away, please. Like don't publish your first app live. Maybe not a good idea. Into pattern number 4, handling errors. And so in this case, I don't know, I thought it was appropriate that the dog flying through the air was an error, but Errors are fun in JavaScript, and I know there's been a couple issues we've run into so far. Namely, first off, don't like when you pass an error, don't pass a string or a number or like false or something. They've all been done. People probably, even in this room, done them. But actually pass an error object with, a stack trace, messages, things like that. Make it useful to the person downstream that's collecting the error. I have throwing is for programmer errors. Not in all senses, but also if you're coming from a language that you throw errors in all the time, like don't throw every error in JavaScript. This was a couple apps we had that went down this path and fundamentally changed the way that they built the app for better or worse. But whenever they ran into an error, they would just throw it and assume someone was catching it. And that had its own issues that then we had to deal with, because now that you're throwing all the errors, now you actually have to explicitly catch all the errors and deal with them in various ways. And it wasn't really playing with the async nature of how we were building our apps. And then in that sense, it goes back to the whole, like, I can't let my app crash. So, you can go back to the whole, like, do you restart on uncaught exceptions or do you actually ignore them? In our case, we're trying to urge teams to actually just let the app die and restart itself. Yeah, different thoughts on that. So in a sense, though, without dwelling on that too much, errors are hard, but actually do make sure to read up on them. I know the best explanation I've seen at this point has probably been like the blog post Joins had a while back, which talked about the various types of errors, how to deal with them. I know that was useful for passing around to our teams and getting them to understand when to use things and when to not. 5. I kid you not, we have something that maybe looks like this too. So wrapping everything in promises. And this is not a promises are bad or promises are good. Just actually make sure you use promises correctly if you're going to use them and understand them. In our case, it's use them for the right reasons. We have teams that are using promises. We have teams that are effectively overusing promises. And in one of those cases, it was, if we're always throwing our errors, promises were an interesting way to deal with it. But it was a chicken and egg thing, effectively. Or if we have this crazy waterfall scenario, promises are an easy way to actually collapse that and make that a little bit saner looking. Again, chicken and egg scenario for the most part. They weren't actually, you could argue, like tapping into the right parts of promises. They were just using them for a solve that they weren't doing something correctly to begin with anyways. At the same time, understand that if you're basing your app on promises and all of your various code that you're depending upon is now in promises, if other people then want to use that code, it makes for a little bit of a hairy scenario if they're not following that model too. And so, modules should expose callback interfaces at a minimum, let's say. And this is something we've been doing for the most part. All of our infrastructure code, all of our actual core code is running that way. Teams can then opt to use promises if they want to from there, but we're not trying to force that upon them. And just a fun little fact at the end, and we're still actually working this down a little bit, but if you are using promises, again, try not to overuse them, but also don't use them or let's say overuse them in hot code paths as well. I know we ran into problems with one of our apps where, as we started profiling it, we started to get horrible results and horrible CPU time that was eaten up just in dealing with promises themselves. And in this specific case, it's, let's say, over-promise example, where it's too much going on. But do be conscientious of that. Obviously, there's more overhead invoked when using a promise versus just a vanilla callback. Let's see. Oh, yeah. And then so for my deal with that, I have my own opinion, but I say, use callbacks. And so here's sort of an interesting one. This is fun during development, is that you can use get URLs in your package.json file. You can effectively cheat the system, if you will, and have a dependency that's in Git. You can use tags. You can pull it in. But inevitably, as you start getting down that path, you'll notice that you'll run into problems. It's easy to get started, and then the problems get hairy as you go. And so part of that is that get URLs aren't leveraging really Semver for the most part. So you can't effectively version things. You can tag them, and then hopefully increment those tags or publish new tags. But if you start, say, overwriting things, you'll get into problems where the module gets cached locally, and then someone's like, dude, I'm installing it. and I'm not getting the code you're telling me that I'm getting. And everyone pulls their hair out for a while, and then you're like, oh, clean your cache. Like maybe that's the problem. And then they do that, and next thing you know, it's working. And so, caching problems, unstable state, just from knowing what you're in. It's really sort of a deal like publish to NPM, like take the time to set it up internally. There's pretty documented solutions. We have Capo that we're running. There's other enterprise versions of it. There are documentation on how to set it up yourself, quite frankly. It's worthwhile to do it and just make sure you're actually using it properly. Yeah, leave that comment away. And then sort of my favorite. So sloppy async code. And there's been a bunch of people that have talked about various aspects of this, but I think part of it is as you're learning new programming techniques and new languages, make sure to actually understand the best practices behind them too. Don't be that guy that creates that like callback waterfall chain that's like 20 levels deep. They've all existed in some code, but if you do see them, like there are ways to solve them, like refactor them, make it better. And so part of that's understanding the actual control flow patterns, and that could be with various modules. It could be with various coding practices that you use. But again, don't be that guy that does that. And so hoist your functions, take them out, collapse it a little bit. Don't do them in line. Use promises appropriately for scenarios like this. Use the library async or various other control flow modules that will allow you to deal with that. But again, make sure that the async code you're writing is actually clean and understandable, because as you get into a larger team, you're inevitably not going to be the only one that's touching that code. Or next month, when you look at it, you're going to be a different person touching that code and not understand what you wrote anyways. And then down that pattern, or down that path, is, if you're writing an async function, understand how it works. Don't think that it just stops the code. And so the example I have is, callbacks with code afterwards, but no return. And so this is pulled people's hair out so many times internally to our teams, where it's like, oh, cool, if true, do this callback. And then, beneath it, the assumption is oh, if false. But in this case, callback and fallback are both going to actually execute. And so inevitably you run into weird race conditions or weird symptomatic scenarios where you're I don't understand why this code is getting executed. It doesn't make sense. And it's just sort of understanding how the fact that it's async and it'll work and it's not necessarily moving it. Again, use good async patterns. Yeah. And then number 8, someone made a comment earlier about this, but having Node do everything. And this has also been a common pattern that we've noticed, where our teams and various companies that I've talked to have all cool, how did you solve all these things with Node? And it's well, we didn't. Don't necessarily think about that. And so a couple of scenarios that always come up, SSL termination, we're not doing it with Node. Most people aren't. Most people, if you look at their flow diagrams, if they're SSL or if they're just a site in general, they probably have some sort of reverse proxy in front of Node. They probably have Nginx or something in front of it. In our case, SSL termination happens at sort of many points along the way, but it definitely isn't happening in Node. Along the same line, heavy encryption with Node, for various parts of our process, we have areas that are followed into categories like this, and they're not done in Node either. Doesn't really need to be done in there. Could be done, may not be the best choice to be done. And so understand those scenarios. And then sort of the tying with the Nginx, there's various other ones I could put in here, but this one always comes up a lot. We have, inevitably, there's an email that comes up or a conversation comes up where they're well, cool, how are you guys, loading your certs into Node, or binding, to this port, or doing gzip, or getting performance out of X, Y, and Z? And it's yeah, we're not. Don't, if your Node process starts up, just start it up on something else. Don't start it up on AD and just have it the front app, especially from how you're going to create multiple apps perspective. But actually understand that there are other pieces of the toolbox that you can use. And so ultimately, understand how those are. Look at what companies are doing, things like that. Use the right tool when it makes sense. And 9. And so this is sort of a fun one. And I swear I almost could tell you I took this picture on the way down, but I didn't. I saw this and I was so ignoring the Node ecosystem. And if you ask me, I think the part of the reason, Node was fun and sexy when we adopted it and it was like, cool, it's JavaScript. You can use it on the server. You can use it on the client. It's great. But the best part about Node since adopting it is literally the ecosystem of Node. It's the fact that I don't need to go write every single damn thing. I don't need to solve all these problems, or more importantly, I can actually reach out to the community on Twitter or in GitHub or in various scenarios, and the community generally responds back with a force. And so actually, like, embrace the ecosystem. And this is sort of its own little anti-pattern. We've had good and bad with this, I think. It's been hard to get our teams to understand that, coming from a background where there isn't as tight-knit of an ecosystem. And so actually getting those teams on board with that and understanding that there's different types of ecosystems. There's an internal ecosystem from amongst all the other Node developers and an external one. And the internal one effectively mimics, on an internal level, the external ecosystem. And so it's sort of like a collaborative, before I go write something, let me go see if something else exists internally. If it doesn't exist internally, let me go see if it exists externally, or how it was done. And so in this case, NPM has a wealth of pre-written code. That's an understatement, I think. You can probably at this point search for anything on NPM and it will be there, including a t-shirt module. I think, not just code-wise, but also information-wise, right? And so node security is a good example like this. Like, you get updates from the community on what's best practices, in this case, security scenarios. It's worthwhile to be tapped into those and pay attention as much as you can. And I think this is obviously preaching to the choir because it's conferences like this that also portray that information and get that out there. But in itself, we need to make sure that our teams are actually thinking at this level too. And so from that perspective, it's, embrace your new community. I do have a warning on here that the community may contain drama. Not that the Node community has any drama, just it could. And on that note, that's the 9th one. So thanks, and I don't know that I have time for QA, but that's over drinks later. Okay.